Vernon Baxter, Managing Director of InvestorPublishing. Welcome to the Care Home Show.
Thanks, Simon. Happy to be here.
Good to see you again. It's been a few months since our last episode, so I know it's usually you that's doing the interviewing rather than being the interviewee. But it's great to see you, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about what's going on in your world.
Thanks. Yeah, no problem.
So before we get stuck into the conversation, for anyone who's not aware, can you share the various different titles of Investor Publishing that Investor Publishing own, and then kind of what the group's best known for? Because there's been a bit of an evolution and things over the last 12 months, which people may or may not be aware of.
Sure. So Investor Publishing was founded part of Nexus Group, which is a larger group that invests into primary care property and runs other corporate finance businesses and other various consultancy sort of projects. Investor Publishing started life as just Health Investor, which is the title that most of the audience of your podcast, I would imagine, associate me with and are aware of, which, as the title suggests, focuses on the investment landscape in healthcare, health and social care. So obviously there's when we launched back in 2004, 2005, there was lots of very good magazines writing about healthcare, lots of very good magazines writing about investment, but not very much coverage of the corporate or the financial side of the health and social care market. So we started life as a kind of single title magazine, subscription magazine, paywalled website, etc., that focuses on health and social care. That evolved in 2010. We launched a second title called Education Investor, which does a very similar thing to Health Investor, has a bit more of an international focus because, or a focus on English language businesses internationally, but very similar, sort of kind of financially led reporting on the education market. And then coming up in 2 years now, actually, time has gone a bit odd over the last sort of 12 months, but I think it was coming up in 20 months ago, we also acquired a publishing business called Hawker Publications. And many of you and your readership will know Care in Times, which was the flagship title of that kind of publishing business, which is obviously one of the most established, kind of well-known magazines for the care sector. Founded by Richard Hawkins, Dr. Richard Hawkins, who we still work with very closely. And that also came with two other titles, the Nursery Management Today, which is similar to Care in Times, but has a focus on the early years sector or the nursery sector, and the Journal of Dementia Care, which is the sort of only sort of dedicated journal to more like a kind of academic journal, which focuses on the kind of best practice and evolution of how people with dementia are cared for. And that also runs the UK Dementia Congress, which is a very large, well-established 3-day event, which brings together a lot of experts in that field. And then earlier this year, obviously kind of not the easiest time to launch a new title, we also launched a title called Nutrition Investor, which is focusing on the sort of nascent investment activity into the world of alternative proteins, free from foods, healthy snacks, that sort of market. So similar to Health Investor, where our angle is not so much to focus on the product particularly, but to focus on the underlying investment activity. So lots of interviews with the private equity, a lot of interviews with the other form of kind of large trade investors that are sort of creating and backing challenger brands in that space.
Got you. As soon as I said a lot's happened in the last 12 months, I knew that it wasn't within a 12-month period that Health Investor had acquired Hawker Publications. But as soon as you said 20 months, I thought to myself, wow, like, the whole COVID set of circumstances just completely distorts any context of timelines and things like that, because I can't quite work out whether it does feel like 20 months ago or not, albeit that's obviously the case. So how's the group had to adapt because of COVID? Because I'm presuming everyone's business has had to change in some way, shape or form. I'm sure yours has as well.
Yeah, I think when you go back to the reasons why we did the acquisition of the Hawker business, is one of the kind of commonalities across all of our brands is that, you know, we put a lot of effort, a lot of time into the editorial coverage, but a large part of our business is bringing communities together, typically through the medium of face-to-face events. So whether or not that's the UK Dementia Congress, which I mentioned, or the Health Investor Awards, or the Health Investor Summit, or the various sort of face-to-face events that we have sort of built our business on, I think the main challenge for us has been that, for obvious reasons, none of those physical events have been possible since March of this year. So I think from a kind of selfish point of view, COVID has been quite disruptive in terms of how we've had to approach our communities. I think the positives are that, and I'm sure we'll go on to talk about this, is that, you know, if you look at the sectors that Investor Publishing sort of focuses on, so healthcare, education, early years, you know, they're very much essential sectors. And I think, you know, there's nothing like a crisis to really test that theory. And so, you know, I think the kind of positive of the last sort of 10 months has been that the areas that we cover have proven themselves to be very vital. Information about those sectors are hugely important to people who are active in them, and the communities that work in those markets are really kind of robust. So I think for us, it's all been about trying to find different mediums and different formats and different ways of engaging that community. Because I think, you know, I'm sure everyone has had a very similar experience. You know, the way that we're talking today is that in some ways video technology means that this sort of stuff is incredibly easy, but it also, I think it changes the dynamic a little bit, where it's kind of, in some ways it's more disposable, and it's easier to turn off, to leave a call than it is to walk out of a conference. And, you know, I think there's a different dynamic. And, you know, I think where at the start, kind of March, April, May, I think people were just finding ways to sort of reproduce a kind of sort of synthetic version of what previously existed. What we've been trying to do is finding ways that where people get more value out of interaction, and we've kind of got to appreciate that you're fighting for a lot of people's time and people's attention in this sort of digital world, because, you know, it's not the same as sort of saying, well, I'm going to block out my day and I'm going to be in the West End and I'm going to be at a conference. You've kind of got to approach things slightly differently. So, you know, we've been doing that through, we had our Health Investor Awards back in October, which was an interesting experience, trying out virtual bars and all these kind of different formats. And then we've been using other platforms. So we had the UK Dementia Congress last week, and we had something like 900 people come through this platform, where you can sort of arrange meetings one-to-one. So you sort of see this life happening outside of the webinar streamed content element of it. So, and then we've got our Health Investor Summit coming up in just under a month, and, you know, similar approach to that, where I've been pre-recording a lot of content, but also running live content and trying to provide kind of platforms for people to network. So yeah, I think it has been an interesting year for anyone who works in events, which obviously isn't all of what we do, but it's a large part of what we do. And we've had to kind of, to use a very 2020 word, pivot, which seems to be what everyone in our world describes themselves as doing. But I think that's kind of has to be how you react to this sort of set of circumstances.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, it seems like, I'm sure, using the kind of the duck analogy of a duck kind of serenely swimming through a pond and then its legs are absolutely going like the clappers underneath the surface. I'm sure there's been a good element of that with the pivot. But I've unfortunately I wasn't around for the Health Investor conference, but but from the people that I've spoken to, they said it was very good. I think nothing's gonna replace a 3D conversation. Unfortunately, we're not in a kind of world of, I don't know, VR or whatever it is yet, where that type of thing is going to be possible. But as I say, the feedback that I've had has been really, really good. People enjoyed it. They felt engaged in the in subject matter and things like that, which is when you can't be in a room with somebody having a bit of a catch up and finding out what's going on in the world. That's I guess that's it's a real appreciation to you and the team for managing to pull it off in the way that you have.
Yeah, and I think for the first half of the year, it was a sort of different dynamic where probably the big question was how long were we going to be living with the virus and what was the time frame. So I think in some ways, the second half or the final quarter of the year has been a bit more straightforward because you kind of know that we're still in this sort of set of restrictions and lockdown, and you can kind of commit to doing things digitally. But I think for us and for a lot of businesses like us, I think there was quite a long period where you didn't know whether or not the right thing to do was to just to kind of shift and move out, thinking that this could be all done by Christmas, as someone faithfully said, or whether or not this would be something that's going to have impact for kind of months and potentially years going forward. So obviously there's still like a lot of uncertainty for anyone, and events in some ways, it's compared to sort of like the importance of healthcare and social care settings. In some ways it's you feel quite disposable because really the world can live without conferences, but you can't live without care homes and you can't live without hospitals. But it still does have an impact on how far ahead you can plan, and what type of kind of organization and how you serve your community during that kind of period is still a bit of an unknown, or still largely an unknown, even if there is positive news on the horizon.
Yeah, definitely. I just whilst you were thinking about that, do you think in the future there will almost be like a blended approach where you'll have kind of a real live event, but then there will be kind of digital elements? So I guess if you're throwing an event for, I don't know, whatever the number 500 people is, you're on some level you're limited to having that 500 people in the room. Could you see a world where you could still have that 500 people in the room, presuming obviously it's safe to do so, but then also you could create a kind of a digital way of being able to be part of that same event as well?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's like I said, it's obviously not the same, and it's difficult to sort of say what's kind of better or worse because you kind of it's not really a fair comparison at the moment. But the thing about digital is it's incredibly accessible for people, and it's incredibly easy to disseminate it to really kind of far-reaching places. I mean, in our education investor brand, we've run a number of events with people on the participants literally been on different continents, the audience literally been from around the world, and from a kind of platform perspective, the costs are effectively minimal. So I think there's elements of how people distribute information and run these sort of events that just won't change post COVID. I think it will become standard to have a sort of hybrid approach, because once you put the effort into running an event and you get great speakers and people put a lot of effort into their presentations, you can have this sort of second life for that content. And I think that will continue. I think going back to the kind of basis of how a business like ours has evolved is that I think that what that kind of content delivery doesn't quite allow in the same way is for people to build their network and to kind of interact with their community in the same way. So I think that's the bit, that's kind of where the internet kind of can't quite reach. It's that sort of relationships, that coffee, the glass of wine afterwards. It's the understanding, how people connect and what people do in their sort of network. I think that's the bit that, has to come back, obviously in line with science and in line with the kind of public health elements of it. But I think that's why there will be a kind of continuing demand for events like the UK Dementia Congress or the Health Investor Awards or the Education Investor Summit, which we're doing in December. I think they will inevitably come back in some sort of form. But I think the world has changed, and especially people's approach to technology. I think the technology to do video calls like this has been around for probably over a decade, but the actual use and prevalence and it needed something like this to actually make people use it in such a kind of large volume that in such a widespread way that it becomes sort of a standard thing to do.
Yeah, I can safely say, as somebody that's been running a consultancy business for the last 4 years, I've definitely wasted a lot of time and money traveling around the country seeing people when I could have been doing doing Zoom calls to the same effect. To your point, though, some of those conversations are best had face to face over a coffee or a beer or a glass of wine or whatever it is. So I guess the how this kind of iterates as our set of circumstances hopefully normalizes will be something interesting to kind of keep in mind and to monitor how things evolve and things. But yeah, so it's been an interesting year for everyone, and there's still plenty more probably strange sets of circumstances to come. So well, from your perspective, what does the world look like from where you are today?
Well, I think going back to that kind of point around certainty and knowing exactly kind of what world you're kind of planning ahead for, I think no one really has the answer, but I think, I expect 2021 to still feel like a disrupted world. And, I think it'll feel a lot more like 2020 than it will like 2019, so even if there's continues to be positive news with the vaccine and rollout, etc. I can't see how there won't still be restrictions around social distancing or just really kind of been cautious around controlling the potential spread of COVID. So I think there's we are cautious in terms of I don't think it's credible to sort of say, well, great, there's a vaccine in March or April, we'll be all in a room together and everyone will have kind of forgotten about this kind of period. I don't think it's going to play out like that. So for us, I think the focus really has to be on kind of content, focus on talking to the leaders in our kind of community, covering the sector, because I think, obviously the virus and COVID is such like a massive topic. In some ways, it can sort of almost sort of overshadow some of the really kind of major issues facing, particularly the social care sector. And obviously with Brexit looming and approaching as well, I think there's going to be a lot of things for people to react to, and there's going to be a lot of requirement for editorial coverage of changes in the market. So I think in terms of how things look for us, I think we're really focused on what's happening in the care sector, what's happening in the wider economic and political environment, and trying to focus on bringing kind of content to people. Because I think, I think it would be sort of slightly naive to sort of say, well, don't worry, we'll be back with a full suite of events in 2021. I think it's probably going to be a bit more bitty than that, and things will kind of possibly kind of go a couple steps forward, one steps back. I mean, it is difficult, but but we just have to kind of be responsive and flexible.
Yeah, definitely, without a shadow of doubt. And from what are the types of conversations that you've been having with providers during the COVID outbreak? What types of things are people telling you about their experience and their kind of insights?
Well, I think obviously there have been different phases, and I think that initial, let's say, kind of March through kind of May phase, I think was really, really difficult for a lot of people. And in fact, I think it was difficult for the entire sector, and it's difficult to look past what a rough period that was for everyone. And I think you speak to a range of different providers. I think everyone was facing really kind of the same issues, and I think obviously we've been living with COVID since March, and I think there's a lot more knowledge, a lot more awareness of the virus now. But going back to March and April really was quite a scary time for operators, for the general public. I mean, I don't want to kind of sugarcoat how difficult that period was for providers. And I think what was amazing was how they responded. I think there was some incredible stories that came out in terms of the people in the front line actually getting through that period, people sort of sleeping at homes and sort of, really kind of committing and sort of safeguarding and looking after their residents. But I don't think anyone could look at that kind of period and not sort of be a little bit scarred by it, because I think it was something that the sector probably hadn't quite faced to that kind of extreme. And I think there are lessons that were learned about, obviously, the interaction with the acute sector, with the NHS, and the kind of supply and the distribution of PPE. I mean, these are all topics that people have come on to the Health Investor and the Caring Times kind of webinars and discuss, but it's obviously been a kind of difficult time. I think in terms of like the difference in terms of responses, I think a lot of providers actually did like an amazing job. I think in terms of what the care sector is kind of can be really great at is things like infection control. They're sort of set up to run environments that would kind of prevent the spread of COVID. So I think that they were able to respond and do a great job. But also, I suppose the flip side of it is the residents that the care sector look after are by definition the most vulnerable people to this disease. So it's I don't think it's until the vaccine is distributed, until the disease kind of prevalence is really reduced, I can't see how any provider can really kind of relax in any sort of sense. It's got to be a kind of state of vigilance, because it's just you can see how destructive it can be, especially once it gets into a setting, and might not always be apparent for a couple of days that there are cases. So I think it's been incredibly tough, but I think there's been some amazing responses as well.
And from the conversations that you have had, what's the kind of general consensus for 2021 and beyond?
Well, and like I said, I don't think they are analogous, the events industry and the care industry, because I think the degrees of kind of seriousness in terms of their pursuits are different. But it's similar in the sense that there are basically so many unknowns. I mean, in theory, the Pfizer vaccine could be like an amazing boon to the sector, because this is still in the media coverage at the moment. It's not just obviously the mortality rates is the most serious element of this, but the situation where people aren't really safely able to visit residents has a massive impact on quality of life for families and for those in care. And if there were some medical steps that were really going to kind of change that, I think that would have a big kind of boost. I think in terms of like general outlook, I think you could probably interpret this different ways, but a lot of the providers I speak to feel that the case for really high quality, well managed elderly care settings has been made throughout this crisis, because when something like this is in the community and when it's out there, you want to know that you can control the variables that limit risk. And obviously people want their independence, and there are pros and cons to living independently or receiving domiciliary care, but also the factors are much harder to control when you compare it to something like a retirement village or a care setting. There's a lot more support for individuals, and there's a lot more that can be done to kind of control that environment. So I think there is positivity about the care settings in the market, and obviously things like occupancy, that across the market took a kind of steep decline for obvious reasons. But I think from what I've kind of heard from people, that seems to be sort of coming back, and I think as the isolation and the loneliness element of lockdown has kind of that has also kind of shown to some people that without elderly relatives or people living on their own, that's not necessarily the best environment, especially if lockdowns is something that we might be living with for 2021 and beyond.
Yeah, no, I'd inclined to agree. So so looking at the world through kind of an M&A lens, if you like, from some of the conversations that I've been having with providers, there's almost two different mindsets, if you like. There's those who are feeling maybe a little less confident, sorry, I should say, and those who are kind of battling down hatches. And then there are also those who are kind of feeling more bullish, who are looking for growth opportunities. Are you able to give an indication on kind of what you'd say the split is in between these two groups, and maybe the reasons for this?
Well, I think a large part of it is derived from where you get your financing from. So I think for if you were a kind of owner operator, maybe it's a family business, and you don't want to take on external capital, then I think there is, you could argue that kind of former cohort that you mentioned in terms of battening down the hatches, ensuring safety of residents, focusing on operational aspects, that may well be a focus. And I think that's kind of completely fine and laudable and understandable. I think the thing that drives M&A activity in the sector, in some ways, has been the same thing that's driven it for the last few years, and in some ways has been unaffected by COVID, is that the care sector is seen as a reliable, going back to what I said at the start, really essential part of the health and social care kind of ecosystem. And the best quality assets, the best quality operators are able to run sustainable, reliable, quality businesses. And I think if you look at the wider world of investment capital, the broad equation is that there's more money than there are businesses available to buy. So the pressure from the kind of outside world to invest into health and into social care, was there before COVID-19, and I would say has increased since. Because if you look at competing asset classes, if you look at sort of offices or retail or other sort of areas, then they haven't fared too well for obvious reasons during the pandemic. Whereas obviously there's been disruption and there's been some really stark operational challenges. But broadly speaking, if you've got money that you need to invest into quality, then health and social care is one of the kind of more defensive, more attractive, fundamental investment markets out there. So I think going back to it sort of derives a little bit from where your financing comes from. So if you're either a care operator that is backed by either a private equity firm, or you have institutional investment behind you, or you're a partner with, say, like a REIT, then you would say, well, if access to capital is not your problem, then actually you could say that this is a good time to go after those kind of growth opportunities. Because, well, I think there hasn't been like a serious reduction in terms of the cost of acquisition, because I think like I said, there's still more money than there are good businesses out there. So I think the cost of acquiring sites and the cost of construction, none of those things have plummeted. But if you believe that the care sector is a safe and defensive place to be, then I don't think the last 9 months will have kind of impacted that investment thesis at all. I mean, if you look, I know this is slightly different to residential care, but if you look at the infrastructure funds who have invested in, a number of them have invested into the specialist care market, I think most of them feel that, to a certain degree, their investment thesis that this is a essential service in the way that kind of electricity, water, transport is, they feel that that's kind of been borne out by during a crisis. These are operational businesses that are essential, and compare that to the high street, or compare that to office blocks, they can get turned off. You can't do that to care sector.
Mm. And would you say the same is true? So if we're looking at the kind of infrastructure investors, is it kind of a similar? Does that appetite? Could you compare that appetite to the real estate investor or REIT world? Would you say, because of the same underlying trends?
I think they have slight distinctions in that the infrastructure, it's sort of slightly confusing because the word infrastructure, you kind of think what they want to do is buy real estate, but in reality, what they want to do is buy utility style businesses that, in other words, are kind of essential. So I think the infrastructure investors are focused on those kind of maybe kind of higher acuity, higher fee sort of businesses, where it's kind of less about the property and more about the kind of level of service and the kind of vulnerable individuals that are looked after. I think in terms of the REITs, in terms of and one thing about 2020 has been that we've started seeing people come in from Europe, start seeing sort of Cofinimo, Edifica, and that kind of just sort of shows that sort of international sort of capital that's focusing on the UK market. We've seen Lone Star from the US move to acquire McCarthy and Stone. That these people are looking to deploy that money, are looking for robust quality businesses that are kind of, you're able to put money to work for 15 to 20 years, and that those businesses and those assets are going to be central to the communities that they serve. So I think there are differences, but essentially it goes back to that central theme of there have been a lot of dry powder in terms of money that people need to spend. And if you look at where, if you're looking for a relatively low risk, so if you're not looking at technology, you're not looking at, other sort of resources like energy or something, then there's a lot to be said for asset classes like health, social care, and education in terms of their robust, sort of kind of pretty solid nature.
Got you. And I know there's kind of quite a big investment emphasis on the senior living space as well as care. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think that has changed over the last sort of 3-4 years. I think retirement villages, it's always been a part of the sector that, in investment terms, has felt underweight in the UK because, I think the famous example is to compare it with Australia and New Zealand and the US, and this has changed over the last few years, but basically a very small percentage of people in that kind of age group of 70 plus choose to buy sort of age specific kind of housing compared to those markets. And I think there's been a kind of long-term view in the market that has to change, because a lot of the housing equity in the UK resides with people over the age of 65, and quite often they've seen their 4-bed house become their principal asset as their family have moved out, and maybe there's 2 people left, or maybe there's 1 person left, and suddenly they're living in the family home and it's not really appropriate, and actually that's where a lot of their personal wealth and their family wealth is tied up. So I think the kind of the view is that there will be a natural evolution where those assets are either kind of sold and the kind of money used to fund later living care, or people take a proactive view that rather than live in a 4 or 5 bedroom in house in the town where their children used to go to school 30 years ago, that they want to live in a sort of age specific setting with facilities, with care accessible, with appropriate kind of accessibility issues in terms of having a property that's easy to manage and not come with all that sort of upkeep. So if you look at the people that have kind of put their money where their mouth is on that, it's really kind of major institutional investors like AXA, L&G, Aviva, people who are putting a lot of money to work into kind of creating these schemes and building the product. And I think that is differentiated from the care market or the traditional care market, where you get kind of quality operators like Avery and Barchester targeting kind of affluent and sort of really kind of quality offering. I think what this is a sort of step before that, and more like a lifestyle proposition as opposed to a kind of care proposition. But
Mm.
obviously the two sort of blend together, and yeah. So I think if you look at the money coming into the market, institutional funds I think are very keen at addressing that need. And if you go back to COVID, you could say that there's pretty strong argument for if you had a kind of a relative or a family member who is in that kind of vulnerable sort of over 65, over 70 category, would you rather that they were in a kind of retirement village sort of complex with proactive sort of sterilization, proactive kind of infection control, nursing available? I think you can start to see why that is in a more appropriate setting than potentially been told, well, you live in this big house, but please don't leave it for 6 months. Then I think that has, like, obviously sort of clinical, but also kind of social and societal sort of impact.
Mm. So taking that into consideration, then, how do you think both the kind of the provider and investor landscape is going to change in the future?
Well, I think on the provider side, I'm sure we will talk about it, but we haven't really kind of mentioned that a lot of the investment that I've been talking about and a lot of the businesses that I've referred to really have been at the kind of private pay end of the market. And I think this has existed prior to COVID, but there is a sort of real risk of the provider landscape really kind of breaking into two markets, where you have that kind of fee paying, more kind of high end sort of private pay market, and then you have the local authority sort of state funded sort of sector, and this obviously varies across the country, but the difference between their kind of funding levels just seems to be kind of growing further and further apart, which has a real kind of impact. So I think it's difficult to look ahead to the provider landscape and seeing that model been sustainable. And so really, I think one of the big unknowns for investors and for operators is to what degree is there a kind of political appetite for taking on this sort of divergence or sort of bifurcation in the market between the kind of private pay £1,300, £1,400 a week market and the kind of 500 to 800 local authority kind of funded sector. And so I think political reform is, it's kind of the dog that never barked, or we've been talking about it for over a kind of decade, but it sort of feels impossible to look ahead and not see that been a major factor in what the provider and investor landscape is going to look like in social care.
Yeah. I guess I'm as cynical as the next person when it comes to the government tackling social care reform. I mean, what changes do you think could be made, and how could those changes affect the landscape if the reform that we would like to see happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to tell. I mean, if you had to bet on anything happening, probably the shortest odds would be on nothing, because that's what we've had for over a decade. And there was probably a bit of optimism, or when Johnson came back with his kind of large majority, there was a kind of feeling that if anyone was going to sort of take it on, now would be the time to do it. With and then obviously, I think COVID and obviously Brexit still been up in the air, has meant that if there's been any progress made, it's been very, very sort of under the radar and slow. So I don't think. I think there's a couple of things going against the prospect of there being proper reform in this parliament. I think firstly, just time. I think because of it extenuating circumstances, a lot of time has gone in terms of battling COVID, battling or preparing or negotiating or not negotiating Brexit. So I think, but if you go back to the sounds that you did hear, is that, you know, all the noises were about closer integration between health and social care, and trying to address some of the silos and trying to address some of the sort of perverse incentives in the schemes, where there's a sort of, you know, there is to a degree, or remains to a degree, a kind of behavior of commissioners that's driven by where costs sit in the system. So, you know, the NHS not really want to take on costs that don't have to sit with them, and vice versa. And, you know, the revenue attached to services driving the behavior of commissioners rather than the, you know, the interests of the individual. I think the risk, if you know, if you were sort of talking to investors about how this could work out in a way that wouldn't be advantageous, is that there is definitely a risk that reform would put greater involvement in social care into the hands of the NHS, which obviously the NHS is fantastic. It's not an anti-NHS thing, but I think there would be a view, or certainly a risk, that certain elements of the social care sector could be subsumed or sort of dominated by the kind of larger player that is the NHS. So I think integration of health and social care budgets at one level is definitely a kind of risk in terms of how that would play out, and whether or not the interests of social care providers would be kind of best served by closer integration. So there is that, and then also, you know, I think it's always been a thorny issue in the UK about the involvement of the independent sector in delivering health and social care services. I think in social care less so, because I think the market has been functioning, and there's been great success stories, and it's driven quality, and there's all these kind of good reasons. But I think, you know, if you go back to where we were in April and May and whatever it was, every Thursday at 8 o'clock, people are out there clapping for the NHS. I think any sort of political move that is seen to kind of dilute the NHS, or is seen or can be construed as a threat to their sort of independence or their own agency, then I think that would be very difficult politically to get through. So I'm, you know, that's maybe a bit of a negative view on what reform might mean for the market. But I think if you know, the more positive view might be that if they can sort of sort out and pay the true cost of care, and put investment into you know, people living well, as opposed to treating people at the kind of end of life, and doing you know what we can to kind of manage our healthcare population, then the positive view is that there could be a much greater role for the social care sector, and that in turn would attract more investment. And I think, you know, that local authority side of the market, you know, it has attracted a lot of investment historically. I think just at the moment it feels like, you know, there probably needs to be a correction, there probably needs to be an increase in funding, and, you know, political reform could bring that. But I think, you know, the pessimistic side is, what does integration mean, and does it come with more powers for the NHS and less autonomy for social care? That would probably be the questions been asked if you were someone putting investing funds into it, as opposed to operating in it.
Sure. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And how do you feel about the future of the care sector, and what can you see happening in the coming years?
Well, I think going back to what we said at the start, is that you know, the essential nature of healthcare and social care in this country, kind of, you can't help but feel optimistic about the market, because, you know, it's such a vital sector. And I think, if anything, you know, it's been a really kind of bumpy, rough few months for social care. But if anything, I think it's raised awareness of the kind of importance of the job that people working in social care do. I think it's probably the frontline element of it has probably shone a light a little bit in terms of the the similarities in terms of workload and risk that people working in care face versus to people working in hospitals. And I think the high mortality rate in care settings has shocked people, but also helped raise awareness of kind of how important this part of the sector is. So I think, trying to be positive, I think we could come out of 2020 with kind of a deeper and wider perception and respect for the work that's done in social care. I think there could be a political imperative to better fund the sector, and a political imperative to sort of grasp the nettle on some of the obvious issues that the sector is facing, probably most starkly in terms of how areas of the country are sort of really kind of sort of shockingly underfunded. And I think in terms of investment capital, I think if the product was there and the product was able to be created, there's no shortage of private capital looking to fund it and looking to help the sector professionalize, to help it to grow, help it to drive quality. So I think all the kind of ingredients or the conditions are there for the sector to kind of have a bright future. I think there's an element of short-termism where people just need to get through the winter, and it's difficult to focus too much on the kind of sunny uplands when we're still right in the middle of the second wave. But I think you can see why or from a kind of investment analysis, why the fundamentals of the market are really attractive to some of the kind of largest and most sophisticated forms of capital invested out there. And I think that will continue to kind of drive interest and activity in the market.
Nice, nice to hear. Good, positive view on kind of the future. I'm very much in agreement that the future does look good, despite the challenges, obviously, that the social care sector is facing at the moment. So, Vernon Baxter, a pleasure as always, and great to have you back on the Care Home Show.
No problem. My pleasure.